We like taking responsibility for things we do, and sometimes for things we don't do and are not responsible for. 2 days before they arrived in India, Esther and Abhijit won the Goldman Sachs Financial Times Award for Business Book of the Year for this book. And all of us at Tehelka were congratulating ourselves as if we were somehow responsible. We weren't. Congratulations on the award. Esther and Abhijit are at MIT, where they run the Poverty Action Lab, and they are really forensic scientists studying causes, symptoms, and consequences of poverty through randomized controlled trials across the developing world. They've arrived at some very lucid and startling conclusions in this book on a variety of issues, from healthcare to housing to education, and we're here, of course, to talk about education specifically in the context of India. Let me start with Esther. Indians are very proud of the fact that they'll have the largest working age population in the first half of the 21st century, what some people call our demographic dividend. Does the state of our schools threaten that dividend?
Yes, definitely. The demographic dividend will turn into a demographic liability unless the schools can churn out people who are not only young but also are qualified and educated. I think there are two reasons. One is the traditional one. Unless you have an educated workforce, then of course they are not able to take advantage of any of the great possibilities that Sam was just talking about. The second one, I think we just saw an illustration very recently, is that I don't know what is worse, whether it's having never gone to school or whether it's having gone to school and having gotten very little out of it. The Arab Spring was started or was ignited by a young man who decided to set himself ablaze. That young man was not uneducated. He had gone to school. He had gone to school for a very long time. He had no job to show for it. Part of the reason is the state of the labor market, but part of the reason is the state of education that you received. And that was Tunisia. And frankly, unfortunately, the state of school is probably a bit worse here. Many parents have now bought in education. They understand they need to send their kids to school, and they do. The enrollment rates in primary school is over 95% in most states in India. But the problem is the kids go in school, they go in school, they go in school. At the end of grade 5, they've usually learned very little. The ASER survey that Pratham has been running since 2005 showed in 2005 that about half the kids who were enrolled in school from grade 2 to 5 could read a grade 1 sentence or a grade 1 paragraph. That was 2005. But in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, it had not improved. So I think this is a real challenge that you have to confront.
Abhijit, to take off from where she concluded, in your book you make this distinction between enrollment and learning. Merely showing up at school or merely getting children to go to school doesn't mean they're actually learning something. And you say that policymakers focus on access, getting children to school, but not so much on whether they're learning anything or the methodology of teaching, really. And do you think Indian policymakers, such as those behind the Right to Education Act, who've been focusing on school access, getting children to school, also fall into that trap?
I learned from Arvind Kejriwal yesterday that one shouldn't necessarily be too shy in expressing one's views. So, so the answer is yes. I think the right to education is what someone, a very sympathetic elite sitting in Delhi thinks of how to help the poor children get educated. It's often, it seems to me, entirely unhinged from the reality of poor parents and the challenges they face. I mean, I think at the core of the bill is this idea that, which I think a lot of upper middle class parents are obviously obsessed by. The key there is to get your child into a school. The school should have a good playing field so that they get some extracurricular activities, and they should have teachers who have a good degree and are paid enough, and they should have toilets for girls and toilets for boys. The whole bill reads like a catalog, a building catalog. you know, and it's sort of, it's very hard to read through the Right to Education and other than by sort of accident encounter the thought that, you know, how shall we promote learning. Indeed, I would say it's not that it's against learning, obviously not, but in some ways some of the core themes in it are sort of exactly, I would say, exactly inimical to how you get children to learn. I mean, I think one of the things that most bothers me is the idea that if this law is actually implemented, many schools, cut-rate private schools that run, I've seen many of them all over India. Every village has 4, 5, 6 cut-rate public schools. These schools are run in somebody's house. They certainly don't have a playing field. They don't even have a proper classroom. Nonetheless, there are places where there are, you know, the teachers are relatively enthusiastic. The children seem much more engaged. There's a whole set of these schools, all of them, and also a whole set of schools run by NGOs, all of them will fall directly afoul of the right to education. And unless something's done to change that, they're going to all have to shut down. And then all those children will be herded back into these government schools where there is a playing field, there are classrooms, there are sometimes separate toilets for boys and girls, but there are often no teachers.
The missing teacher is a very important narrative in this book. And one of the reasons children are not learning, Esther and Abhijit argue, is because teachers are often absent. In fact, India has one of the world's highest teacher absence ratios. A teacher in a government school in India, they find, misses more than 1 day out of 5 in school. It's amongst the highest ratios in the world, along with, I think, Uganda. And there's one paragraph I'd like to quote here. The evidence from India suggests that even when teachers are in school and are supposed to be in class, they are often found drinking tea, reading the newspaper, or talking to a colleague. Overall, 50% of teachers in Indian public schools are not in front of a class at a time they should be. How are the children supposed to learn? How indeed, Esther, and why are these teachers missing? Are they overburdened? Are they bored? Are they underpaid?
I think they are neither overburdened nor underpaid. They might be bored. I think they are often at a loss. I think it's very easy when you see statistics like that, like 1 day in 2, the teacher is either not present or is not doing any teaching duty, to conclude that, oh, the teacher is a culprit, the teacher is a political appointee, the teacher has no interest in the children. But the truth is that a lot of people here, like anywhere else, go into the teaching profession with the desire to do something. And then something happened to them somewhere along the way that leads to this complete loss of morale, which is manifested both by this high absence rate and also by the fact that if and when they teach in a somewhat desultory way. And I don't think that's their carelessness. I think it's often the fact that the way their mission is defined is not particularly clear or not particularly productive. And by that, I'm not saying that they're overburdened by conducting the census. I think that's a smokescreen. I think they are overburdened because they are told, your objective is to bring all of the children you have in front of you to teach them this completely insane curriculum that involves like piles and piles and piles of books that the kids can't even carry on their back. And you have to start that from grade 1, and you have to bring the kids until grade 12. And they know they can't do it. They know they can't do it for most of the kids. Maybe for teachers in rural India somewhere, they know they won't get the vast majority of the children they have to grade 12. So their job is kind of finished before it's even started. And I think that's extremely despairing for them. That's very despairing for the students as well. And that's maybe the core fundamental sin in the system.
If I could ask a subsidiary question, Esther, one of the findings in their book is that the same teachers who were not very good in in school, when they were brought in for extra classes or for summer school, where there was no pressure on finishing a syllabus or a curriculum, actually perform better.
Right. So I just said earlier that children aren't, so many children go to school for 5 years, and at the end of 5 years, they can't read. That's a bit of a disaster, right? So you might think, well, maybe it's very, very difficult to teach a child to read, but the fact is it's not true. There are NGOs, there are programs like Pratham and many others who are able to take a kid who couldn't read in a very short amount of time. I'm talking about 2-3 months, get these kids to a level where they can actually read. And one of the big puzzles, one thing that has puzzled us is why aren't those things done? Why is it possible to do it out of school in these camps, remedial camps for a few months, and it's not done in school? So we tried with Pratham, with the government in various places to train the teachers and couldn't really get much leverage when we tried to get them to do that during the school year. Okay. But instead, if you teach them to do that and you give them some time during the summer to do it during summer camps, they are willing to come back. B, they are not absent during the summer camp. C, they are actually teaching in a way that at the end of the summer camp, there are tremendous gains for the kids who have actually attended those camps. That shows the teacher can do it. The big, big difference is this mission. In the summer camp, it was clear, you take these kids who can't read, you teach them to read. You don't teach them nuclear physics, not yet. You teach them to read, and you can do it, and they can do it. And when you do that, because it happens to be true, the teachers can do it, the students can do it, then they do it.
Abhijit, following from that, learning is a dynamic process. You learn what your teacher teaches you. You also learn, in a sense, what you want to learn and what your parents want you to learn. Now, parents such as the ones in this room take a knowledge of English for their children for granted. So the child can learn anything from mathematics to pottery. But for the vast majority of Indians, English becomes this game changer. I somehow have to know English, and I must send my child to any old school. There's a line in your book, expectations about what education is supposed to deliver distort what parents demand of schools. Is this true really for this thirst for English? Because I have, like people who work with me in Delhi, they send their son to any old English school, irrespective of what else is being taught there.
It's definitely, it's definitely true that there is an enormous thirst for English. I've a hard time, I think the evidence I've seen is very mixed on whether that's per se a good thing or a bad thing. I think the more general point that we were trying to make there was, I would stand by, which is that I think parents have very clear notion of what education is, and that notion is in some ways also central to the dysfunctionalities of the educational system. It's sort of, the parents seem to act, and I think it's one of the things that you will notice if you go to a sort of village and you're talking about education, parents will often do something which I don't think any parent in this room will, which is they'll sort of, there are two children standing here, and they'll say, oh, he's really not, he's a buddhu, he can't really manage a school, so we're sending him to government school. And, and then sometimes it's even the girl, she's really smart, we're sending her to a private school, she's learning English. And I think the more general notion that I think is very much there is the idea that parents very early decide that the goal of education is to get through to class 12 and get a job. I think if you look at all the evidence from the world, it's any bits or pieces that you learn along the way, all of them deliver value actually. Actually, you learn from many things. You don't just learn from getting through the class 12 exam. Even if you got to 8th grade, your earnings are about, 50% higher than if you didn't get to 8th grade over your lifetime, which is a huge gain. So it's somehow the parents and the entire system seems to be discounting the benefits of learning a little and focusing on, if my child could only learn English and speak English fluently, then there will be gains. Not that, even if he could learn a few words of English, he could learn a little bit of math, there would be gains there. So I think there is a general kind of winner-take-all mentality in how people think about education, which then builds on itself, because most kids, of course, can't get there given their background, given the teaching available, so then they give up very fast. Everybody in the system gives up on children very, very early, because they feel that, since the goal is to get to class 12, get to learn English, be able to write and read in English, that's not going to happen. And since it's not going to happen, it's kind of over. The story is over for most children on day 2.
There's this fascinating story they tell in their book about identity and education. In a randomized experiment, they gave 2 sets of evaluators answer sheets, I presume, of children with caste names and answer sheets of children without caste names, with only the first name. And in the answer sheets with no caste names, the children did reasonably similarly to each other. When you had answer sheets with caste names, the children from the so-called lower caste consistently did worse than the children from the so-called upper caste. Sometimes even the so-called lower caste evaluators gave the so-called lower caste children lower marks. And this is completely fascinating, because to what degree does identity, family background, and who we are determine what we learn? Esther, would you like to take that?
I think Abhijit just talked about the importance of expectation, the fact that parents and teachers, I spoke about teachers, he spoke about parents, they think that it's very important that the kid manages to get till grade 12. Now, that means that it's very important what they believe, what their children can do, and likewise, teachers must believe in the children must believe in themselves, and the parents must believe in the children. So if everybody believed in this way, in some sense, I would be self-reinforcing and I would be great. The problem is that for a lot of poor kids or a lot of low-caste kids, it's exactly the opposite, which is this idea that you need to get to the top is compounded by the idea that not only that, but you know what, you can't. And what happens is that the kids themselves, if you make them do simple acute tests, like solving mazes, and you just ask them to solve mazes, and they solve their mazes, and the low-caste kids do just as well as the high-caste kids, because it has not much to do with background, your ability to solve a maze. If you do the same game, but first you say, hi, you are so-and-so, which reveals the full caste name of the child, and reveals to the child that the examiner knows the full caste name of the child, then the low-caste children do much worse. Another one is that have students write essays, have teachers grade the essays, with or without the name of the child. And again, if the name of the child is there, the teachers give lower marks to the lower caste children than if they are not there. Now, what is really tragic is who does that? It's not the upper caste teachers who are discriminating against lower caste students. It's the lower caste teachers who are themselves so convinced and have so much bought in and into the idea that these kids can't do it, that they actually mark them lower. Probably not out of meanness, but out of being convinced. So what is happening is that everybody is convinced that the child can't do it, the child gets convinced themselves that they can't do it, and therefore, as a result, they can't do it. Because if no one has the enthusiasm, the energy, and the faith in a particular child, what is the child going to do?
Esther, if I could take a supplementary question, if I could ask you to tell the story of where identity does not matter. Your example from Israel between, and the comparison between Jewish children who migrated from Ethiopia and Jewish children who migrated from Russia. Why don't you tell us that story?
So of course, one could say, well, but identity does matter because these lower caste children, after all, it's true that statistically their children their teachers, their parents may not be able to read themselves, they might be first generation learner, that's much harder for them to learn, so of course they're not going to go as far. But the truth is that that's really not putting enough belief in how much a school can do. This experiment you're talking about is like, this is In Israel, many Jews from Ethiopia were airlifted on one single day with their children, like saved from Ethiopia where something was happening. And then they were scattered around schools all over the country, and they started studying in the schools. Their background was much different than that of the other Israelis or the children of Russian parents who themselves had come from Russia with PhDs and things like that. So they start at a much lower level. By the end of secondary school, they have almost caught up. That shows that a school that is run with the idea of making the kids succeed can make the kids succeed. Enormous amount of things are happening in the schools or could be happening in the schools if the schools are determined to get it right. So this obsession that we have with the background, it's just, and the obsession that that everybody has with the background is self-defeating and wrong.
Okay. Abhijit, we were discussing testing yesterday, and you actually support testing. A lot of people in India feel that testing is sort of harmful for the child, is insensitive, and class 10 tests have been abolished. And in fact, children can be promoted every year right till class 12, or class 10, I believe, without, thank you, that's the first bell, right? Yeah. Without a test. But you say that this is an old-fashioned idea which went out of the window many years ago in the US, and actually testing is good.
Well, testing does three things, and one of which I think is the one that people who frame this policy, again, I think this is the instinct of the elites who are out to do good, is that they can be punitive, they can be used against the child. And I think that there is a lot to that, and we need to be careful about that. There are two other things testing does. One is it helps people assess schools. And I think one of the things that's very frightening to me is the idea that, you know, parents, semi-literate parents have to choose basically between private and government schools, or between one private school or another private school, and there's no guidance available. So one of the things that in the US is done quite carefully is to have testing of children, sort of compulsory testing of children, but compulsory testing where only the school level scores are revealed. So you don't necessarily have to use the scores punitively against the children. It's just you find out which school is teaching well and which school isn't. And without that kind of testing, some kind of a reliable public exam where you can, so Massachusetts, where I live, has a 4th grade and an 8th grade exam which every child has to take. That doesn't mean every child gets his score back. It means the school is, you know, you see which schools are completely not delivering education. How is a parent supposed to know which schools are teaching well if there are no exams that are objectively given by some outsider? Second problem, I think, is just that this is just a, you know, given how innovative we are as Indians, what will happen if you abolish class 10 testing is that, you know, parents still want to know what their children are good at and what their children are bad at, and they don't trust the schools. So there'll be a mushrooming of tests. I predict this, we'll see in a couple of years, mushrooming of tests, the kind of the SAT equivalence where children will take all kinds of tests to signal to colleges, signal to you know, better schools that they are doing well. And those tests will be expensive and the poor will be excluded from it. So in some ways, giving people some indication of how well they are doing is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be punitive. There is, the right to education doesn't exclude that, but it has this idea of continuous evaluation. We're working with the Haryana government to kind of work on what continuous evaluation means, except that I think right now it's a long way from getting that idea absorbed in the teaching system. So I think continuous evaluation right now means no evaluation. So eventually maybe we'll solve that problem, but in the meanwhile there'll be a whole cohort of people who'll get no guidance to how well they're doing just because out of the goodness of our heart we've decided to liberate them from testing, but they're not liberated from the economic system, they're not educated from the parents' expectations, so I think this is not going to exactly help them.
Abhijit, if I could squeeze in one small question, you talk in the book about picking a winner. A family has 5 children and says, we will put all our money on this one child. How does a family pick a winner? Is it a form of Darwinism? Is it a form of testing, informal testing?
It's an interesting subject. Lots of people have been looking at it, and one of the things I just saw a study from Burkina Faso where they actually look at the child's kind of their kind of an IQ measure, however dubious that might be, and they find that parents are actually not bad at picking the child with the highest IQ measure to put their money on. So, but the core fact that you mentioned is really interesting, which is that parents are making these choices somehow based on the performance of the child in first or second grade, deciding this child I'm going to put my money on, all the other children are basically not going to get an education. That's sort of, I mean, think of what happens to a child when at grade 2 he's told by his parent, "Tum to buddhu ho." So you're written off at that point. I think that brutality, that I think the whole education system with its sort of top-heavy emphasis on its emphasis on, you know, you're a buddhu unless you can read a whole textbook in class 2. That just idea, I think there is a certain amount of just base cruelty in the way the education system is now framed.
Fine. Thank you so much, Esther and Abhijit, for an enthralling and engrossing conversation, and looking forward to your next book.